Picture this. The year is 1792 before the Common Era. Along the banks of the Euphrates River, in a city that most neighboring kingdoms barely noticed, a young king named Hammurabi has just inherited a throne that controls little more than 50 square miles of dusty Mesopotamian territory. Around him, powerful empires flex their muscles. Larsa to the south, Eshnunna to the east, Mari to the northwest. Any one of them could crush Babylon like an insect. Yet, within 4 decades, this obscure city-state will dominate the entire civilized world, and its king will craft a legal code so influential that its principles still echo through courtrooms today, 4,000 years later. This is the story of how Babylon rose from nothing to become the crown jewel of the ancient world, and how it fell not once, but twice, only to be reborn in even greater glory. The tale of Babylon begins not with conquest or divine intervention, but with geography and the slow accumulation of power by a people history once dismissed as barbarians. The Amorites, a Semitic-speaking population, had been filtering into Mesopotamia for generations. Nomadic shepherds transformed into city dwellers. By the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, they had established themselves across the region, and one particular Amorite leader named Sumuabum founded a dynasty in a settlement called Babylon, around 1894 BCE. The location itself held strategic importance. Positioned where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers drew closest together before emptying into the Persian Gulf, Babylon sat at the crossroads of ancient trade routes. But strategic location alone doesn't build empires. For its first century of existence, Babylon remained thoroughly unremarkable. Sumuabum and his immediate successors, Sumualailum, Sabium, Apil-Sin, and Sin-Muballit, were pragmatic rulers focused on survival rather than glory. They built defensive walls, dug irrigation canals, renovated temples, and conquered the occasional nearby town when opportunity presented itself. Dilbat fell, then Kish, Sin-Muballit, Hammurabi's father, managed to fend off the powerful King Rim-Sin I of Larsa, buying Babylon precious breathing room. Yet when Hammurabi ascended the throne around 1792 BCE, his kingdom consisted of perhaps 4 or 5 cities. The young king inherited a realm dwarfed by its neighbors, a minor player in a deadly game of Mesopotamian power politics, where alliances shifted like desert sands and yesterday's ally became tomorrow's conquest. What made Hammurabi different from his predecessors wasn't military might or divine mandate. It was patience married to ruthless pragmatism. The early years of his reign revealed a leader who understood that premature aggression meant annihilation. Rather than immediately launching campaigns he couldn't win, Hammurabi spent his first 2 decades transforming Babylon from within. He issued proclamations forgiving debts, a gesture that won him popular support, while establishing him as a benevolent ruler in the ancient tradition. He poured resources into infrastructure, constructing bridges across the Euphrates that allowed the city to expand beyond its original boundaries, building granaries to store surplus harvests, excavating new irrigation canals that turned marginal lands into fertile fields. Most importantly, he renovated the temples dedicated to Marduk and other gods, presenting himself as a pious king devoted to divine will rather than personal ambition. These weren't merely public relations maneuvers, though Hammurabi clearly understood their propaganda value. The agricultural improvements genuinely increased Babylon's productivity, swelling both population and tax revenues. The religious renovations secured the crucial support of the powerful priestly class. The debt forgiveness, which Hammurabi would repeat 4 times during his reign, created a population fiercely loyal to their king. Meanwhile, Hammurabi was forging alliances across Mesopotamia, particularly with Zimri-Lim, the king of Mari to the northwest. These decades of patient preparation transformed Babylon from a marginal city-state into a regional power capable of projecting force. But Hammurabi waited, biding his time while his rivals aged and their kingdoms fractured from internal pressures. The dam finally broke around 1787 BCE, when Hammurabi made his first significant military move, conquering Uruk and Isin from Rim-Sin I of Larsa. These weren't random targets. Both cities controlled vital agricultural territory and commanded important positions along the irrigation networks that fed southern Mesopotamia. Yet, even after this success, Hammurabi exercised restraint, immediately shifting his attention northward and eastward, rather than pressing his advantage against Larsa. This pattern, swift, decisive action, followed by strategic patience, would characterize his entire military career. He understood what many conquerors never grasp: that sustainable empire building requires knowing when not to fight as much as when to strike. The geopolitical landscape of Hammurabi's era was extraordinarily complex, a multiplayer game where no single power could dominate through force alone. A diplomatic report from the period captures this reality perfectly. There is no king who is powerful for himself. With Hammurabi, the man of Babylon, go 10 or 15 kings, so with Rim-Sin, the man of Larsa, with Ebal-Piel, the man of Eshnunna, go 20 kings. These weren't formal alliances in any modern sense, but rather fluid coalitions of convenience, where smaller kingdoms attached themselves to stronger patrons for protection and profit. Hammurabi excelled at this game, forming alliances precisely when needed, then breaking them without hesitation when circumstances changed. His conquest of Larsa demonstrates this calculated duplicity perfectly. The Elamites, a powerful kingdom to the east, attempted to foment conflict between Babylon and Larsa by playing them against each other. When Hammurabi and Rim-Sin I discovered this manipulation, they formed an alliance and crushed the Elamite forces together. But Rim-Sin's contribution to the joint military effort proved minimal. Whether through calculation or incapacity remains unclear. An enraged Hammurabi, angered by his allies' failure to provide meaningful support, immediately turned his armies south and conquered Larsa itself around 1763 BCE. This single campaign gave Babylon control over the entire lower Mesopotamian plain, including the ancient and wealthy cities of Nippur, Ur, and Uruk. With his southern flank secured, Hammurabi pivoted northward. The absence of his armies in the south had created power vacuums and unrest in the northern territories, which he now moved to fill. Eshnunna fell, giving Babylon control over the eastern approaches and access to the Zagros mountain trade routes. Then came the most personally significant conquest, Mari. For years, Hammurabi and King Zimri-Lim had been allies and apparently genuine friends. Mari's extensive archives, far more detailed than Babylon's own records, which have largely dissolved into mud beneath the modern water table, contain numerous letters detailing their cooperation. Zimri-Lim received regular intelligence reports on Hammurabi's movements and campaigns, possibly because he recognized that eventually, only one of them could dominate Mesopotamia. That recognition proved prescient. By 1761 BCE, with all other significant powers eliminated or subdued, Hammurabi turned on his old ally. Mari fell, and Hammurabi's treatment of the city reveals the darker side of his statecraft. Unlike most conquered territories, which he incorporated intact into his growing empire, Hammurabi ordered Manri systematically destroyed. Whether this reflected personal betrayal, strategic calculation about Mari's defensibility, or simple cruelty, we'll never know. What's certain is that, by the end of this campaign, Hammurabi controlled virtually all of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Assyria in the north. An empire stretching roughly 250 miles along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Yet military conquest alone doesn't explain Babylon's transformation into a dominant power or Hammurabi's enduring historical reputation. The secret of his success lay in what he did after the fighting stopped. Previous conquerors, like Sargon of Akkad centuries earlier, had united Mesopotamia through force only to watch their empires immediately begin fragmenting under the weight of constant rebellions and internecine conflict. Hammurabi recognized that sustainable imperial control required more than military might. It demanded a framework of law and administration that could govern diverse peoples without requiring constant personal intervention. This insight gave birth to the most famous achievement of Hammurabi's reign, the Code of Hammurabi. Toward the end of his rule, Hammurabi commissioned legal experts to gather existing laws from across his empire and codify them into a single, comprehensive legal system. The result was a collection of 282 case laws inscribed on a massive diorite stele, a finger-shaped black stone pillar over 7 feet tall. At the top, A carved relief depicts Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the Babylonian god of justice, receiving a measuring rod and tape, symbols of his divine authority to establish law. Below, in column after column of precise cuneiform script, the laws themselves unfold in systematic detail. The Code wasn't the first Mesopotamian legal collection. Earlier examples include the Code of Ur-Nammu, the laws of Ish-Nuna, and the Code of Lipit Ishtar. What made Hammurabi's code revolutionary was its comprehensiveness and its explicit connection to centralized state authority rather than local custom. These weren't tribal laws or city traditions. They were the uniform law of the empire, applicable to all subjects regardless of their origin. This represented a radical departure from the patchwork of local customs that had previously governed Mesopotamian life, where each city maintained its own legal traditions and dispute resolution methods. The laws themselves cover an extraordinary range of human activity: business contracts and trade regulations, property rights and inheritance, family law including marriage and divorce, agricultural practices and water rights, professional standards for doctors and builders, and criminal penalties for everything from theft to assault to false accusation. Nearly half the code focuses on contracts and commercial relationships, reflecting the sophisticated market economy of Babylonian society. Another third addresses household and family matters. Who can inherit property? Under what circumstances divorce is permissible? What constitutes legitimate grounds for dissolving a marriage? How adopted children should be treated. The most famous principle embedded in the code is lex talionis, the law of retaliation, better known as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Law 196 states explicitly, if a man destroy the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. This principle of proportional justice seems harsh to modern sensibilities, but it actually represented progress toward more measured punishment. In societies governed by blood feuds and family vendettas, an injury to one person could spiral into massacres of entire clans. Lex talionis established clear limits. Punishment must match the crime. No more, no less. However, the code's justice was far from egalitarian. Babylonian society divided into three distinct classes: the Awilim or property gentlemen, the Mushkanim or free commoners, and the Wardum or slaves. And the code prescribed different penalties based on the victim's social status. A doctor who successfully treated a gentleman received 10 silver shekels, but only 5 for treating a freedman and 2 for a slave. The penalties for malpractice followed the same sliding scale. A doctor whose wealthy patient died had his hands cut off, but if a slave died, he merely paid the owner compensation equal to half the slave's value. This tiered justice system offends modern principles of equality before the law, yet it reflected the social reality of ancient Mesopotamia. What often gets overlooked in discussions of Hammurabi's Code are its more progressive elements. The code established the presumption of innocence. The first 2 laws prescribe punishments for those who make unsubstantiated accusations, determined by the same lex talionis principle. Written evidence was valued highly, especially in contract disputes. The code recognized the importance of examining a defendant's intentions, not merely their actions. Perhaps most remarkably, Hammurabi ordered copies of the code erected on stone pillars throughout his empire, with explicit instructions that these be accessible to anyone who felt wronged. For a society where literacy was confined largely to the scribal class, the code provided that anyone could have the laws read aloud to them. A concrete measure toward accessible justice, even if imperfect by our standards. The prologue and epilogue of the code reveal Hammurabi's self-conception as a divinely appointed shepherd of his people. He describes himself as chosen by the gods Anu and Enlil to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak, and to see that justice is done to widows and orphans. Whether this represented genuine conviction or sophisticated propaganda, or both, Hammurabi clearly understood the power of positioning himself as a benevolent lawgiver rather than merely a conqueror. His personal letters to officials throughout the empire reinforce this image, frequently discussing the welfare of his subjects and emphasizing fair treatment under the law. Life in Hammurabi's Babylon was defined by this intersection of law, religion, and commerce. The city itself sprawled along both banks of the Euphrates, connected by bridges that Hammurabi had constructed. Massive defensive walls surrounded the urban core, testimony to the constant military threats that had shaped Mesopotamian urban planning for millennia. Within those walls, Babylon functioned as a cosmopolitan hub that attracted migrants from across the empire and beyond. The population was extraordinarily diverse. Amorites, Akkadians, Sumerians, and others mingled in the markets and streets, their varied languages and customs gradually blending into a distinctly Babylonian urban culture. The rhythm of Babylonian life revolved around agriculture and trade. Barley and wool were the foundations of the economy, with vast estates owned by the king, temple complexes, and wealthy private individuals producing surplus for trade. The difficult labor of digging irrigation canals, plowing fields, and tending livestock fell to a mixture of hired workers, conscripted labor, and slaves. Though slavery in Babylon was often a temporary condition related to debt rather than a permanent hereditary status. Soldiers received land grants in return for military service, with a portion of the harvest serving as their salary. Religion permeated every aspect of Babylonian existence. The city's patron deity, Marduk, had risen to prominence alongside Babylon itself, gradually usurping the position of supreme god from earlier deities like Enlil. The Esagila, Marduk's great temple, dominated Babylon's skyline, its associated ziggurat Etemenanki rising in stepped tiers toward the heavens. This structure, which may have inspired the biblical Tower of Babel narrative, embodied the Babylonian understanding of temples as literal bridges between earth and the divine realm. Inside the temple, an elaborate cult statue of Marduk received daily offerings of food, wine, and beer, tended by priests who alone were permitted to enter the god's presence. The statue wasn't a mere representation. For Babylonians, it was the god himself manifest on earth. The annual New Year festival, the Akitu, represented the pinnacle of Babylonian religious life. This 12-day celebration in early spring involved the ritual reenactment of Marduk's victory over the chaos goddess Tiamat. As described in the Enuma Elish creation epic, statues of gods from across the empire were paraded through Babylon's streets, culminating in a procession along the famous processional way through the Ishtar Gate and into the city's sacred precincts. The festival united heaven and earth, rich and poor, king and commoner, in a shared celebration of cosmic order, triumphant over chaos, a metaphor that resonated powerfully in a world where political chaos remained an ever-present threat. Yet, for all Hammurabi's achievements in law, religion, and urban development, his empire proved remarkably fragile. When he died around 1750 BCE, he passed the throne to his son, Samsu-iluna, who immediately faced challenges his father's reputation had temporarily suppressed. The empire's lack of natural defensive boundaries made it vulnerable to external pressure, while the diverse populations Hammurabi had united under law harbored no particular loyalty to Babylon beyond their fear of its military power. Within years of Hammurabi's death, the southern regions broke away under a native Akkadian king, forming the independent Sealand dynasty that would remain free of Babylonian control for nearly 3 centuries. In the north, an Assyrian governor named Puzur-Sin drove the Babylonians from Assyrian territory around 1740 BCE, ending Babylon's brief dominance over the northern kingdoms. Samsu-iluna fought desperately to maintain his father's empire, but by the end of his reign, Babylonian control had contracted to approximately the territory Hammurabi had inherited, a handful of cities around Babylon itself. The great empire had lasted barely a generation. For the next millennium and a half, Babylon's fortunes waxed and waned. The Kassite dynasty ruled for over 4 centuries, adopting Babylonian culture while maintaining control through military strength. The second dynasty of Isin produced Nebuchadnezzar I, who briefly restored Babylonian prestige by defeating the Elamites and recovering the sacred statue of Marduk they had stolen. But these were temporary resurgences in a longer story of decline, as Babylon increasingly fell under the shadow of Assyria, the militaristic northern kingdom that would dominate Mesopotamia for centuries. The true rebirth of Babylonian power came in 626 BCE, when an Assyrian official named Nabopolassar seized the throne of Babylon and declared independence. The timing was perfect. Assyria, which had seemed invincible for generations, was tearing itself apart through civil wars and external pressures. Nabopolassar allied with the Medes, another ancient enemy of Assyria, and together they methodically dismantled the Assyrian Empire. In 612 BCE, their combined forces besieged and sacked Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, in an orgy of destruction so complete that the city would never recover. By 609 BCE, the last remnants of Assyrian resistance had been crushed, and Mesopotamia was divided between Babylon and the Medes. Nabopolassar's son would transform this military success into genuine imperial glory. Nebuchadnezzar II, who took the throne in 605 BCE, reigned for 43 years and became the most powerful ruler in the ancient world. His military campaigns secured Babylonian control over virtually the entire Fertile Crescent, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. At the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, he crushed an Egyptian army and ensured that the Neo-Babylonian Empire would succeed Assyria as the dominant Near Eastern power. But Nebuchadnezzar's most lasting impact came not through conquest, but through construction. He embarked on a building program so ambitious that it transformed Babylon into the wonder of the ancient world. The city sprawled over 3 square miles, surrounded by massive double walls so thick that chariot races could be held on top of them. The Euphrates flowed through the city's heart, spanned by a magnificent stone bridge. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt the Atemenanki ziggurat on an even more massive scale and restored the Esagila temple with lavish decoration. He constructed the famous Ishtar Gate, decorated with brilliant blue glazed bricks and reliefs of dragons and aurochs, which opened onto the processional way lined with images of lions. According to tradition, Nebuchadnezzar also built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, supposedly to please his Median wife Amytis, who missed the green mountains of her homeland. Ancient writers describe these gardens in vivid detail. Terraced gardens rising in ascending tiers, watered by ingenious hydraulic systems that lifted water from the Euphrates to irrigate plants and trees from across the known world. However, no definitive archaeological evidence for the gardens has ever been found, leading many scholars to question whether they existed at all, or whether later, writers confused them with gardens built by the Assyrian king Sennacherib at Nineveh. Nebuchadnezzar's reign also marks a crucial moment in Jewish history. In 597 BCE, he captured Jerusalem and deported much of the Jewish elite to Babylon. When the kingdom of Judah rebelled again a decade later, Nebuchadnezzar returned in 586 BCE, besieged the city for 18 months until its population was literally starving, then razed it to the ground. The Temple of Solomon was destroyed, and thousands more Jews were carried off to Babylon in what became known as the Babylonian captivity. Yet, the biblical texts present a surprisingly nuanced view of Nebuchadnezzar, portraying him not as a monster, but as God's appointed instrument, a king who could be stern but also just, even protective of Jewish prophets like Jeremiah and Daniel. The Jews in Babylonian exile weren't imprisoned or enslaved in the conventional sense. They formed communities, built houses, engaged in commerce, and some even rose to positions of influence in the Babylonian administration. The Book of Daniel describes how talented Jewish youths were specifically recruited and trained for service in Nebuchadnezzar's court. This relatively benevolent treatment doesn't erase the trauma of exile and cultural disruption, but it stands in stark contrast to other ancient practices of population transfer. After Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire entered a period of instability. 4 different rulers occupied the throne in just over a decade, none able to match Nebuchadnezzar's combinations of military prowess and administrative skill. The last king, Nabonidus, who took power in 556 BCE, proved to be the empire's undoing, though through religious heterodoxy rather than military weakness. Nabonidus was an unusual figure, deeply interested in archaeology and ancient traditions. Modern historians sometimes call him the archaeologist king, for his restoration projects at ancient sites throughout Mesopotamia. But Nabonidus made a fatal miscalculation. He attempted to elevate the moon god Sin above Marduk in the Babylonian pantheon. This wasn't merely a theological dispute. It struck at the heart of Babylonian identity and threatened the power and prestige of Marduk's extensive priestly establishment. The priests of Marduk controlled enormous wealth and wielded significant political influence. By suppressing Marduk's cult in favor of Sin, Nabonidus alienated the very institution that had historically legitimized Babylonian kingship. Making matters worse, Nabonidus spent much of his reign away from Babylon, living in the Arabian oasis of Tema, and leaving his son Belshazzar to govern in his absence. Without the king present to lead the crucial New Year rituals, the Akitu festival couldn't be properly celebrated, disrupting the cosmic order that Babylonians believed maintained the world's stability. This religious crisis weakened internal support for Nabonidus precisely when external threats were mounting. To the east, a new power was rising. Cyrus II of Persia had overthrown the Median Empire and consolidated control over a vast territory stretching from modern Afghanistan to the borders of Mesopotamia. By 540 BCE, he had initiated a campaign against Babylon. What happened next became the subject of competing narratives. The Babylonian Chronicles and the Cyrus Cylinder both claim that Babylon was taken without battle, that the city's gates opened peacefully to the Persian conqueror. The Greek historians Herodotus and Xenophon, writing much later, describe a siege and forced entry. The truth likely combines elements of both accounts. The priests of Marduk, angry at Nabonidus's religious policies, may have actively facilitated Cyrus's takeover. Cyrus, displaying the political acumen that would characterize Persian imperial policy, presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a champion of Marduk sent to restore proper worship and cosmic order. He immediately reversed Nabonidus's religious innovations, lavishly patronized Marduk's cult, and allowed exiled populations, including the Jews, to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. On a single October day in 539 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire ended. Yet Babylon itself didn't disappear. Under Persian, Greek, and Parthian rule, the city remained culturally distinct for centuries, its religious traditions and scholarly practices continuing to influence the ancient world. Babylonian astronomers made observations that would shape Greek and Roman understanding of the heavens. The ziggurats continued to function as religious centers. People bearing Babylonian names appear in documents for generations after the political independence had vanished. The legacy of Babylon extends far beyond its geographical boundaries or political duration. Hammurabi's Code influenced legal systems throughout the ancient Near East, including, many scholars argue, the Mosaic Law of the Hebrew Bible. The principles of written law, presumption of innocence, and proportional punishment that the code established became foundational concepts in Western legal tradition. Today, a carved relief of Hammurabi appears in the United States Supreme Court building, alongside other great lawgivers of history, a testament to his enduring influence 4 millennia after his death. Babylon's contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and architecture shaped subsequent civilizations. The sexagesimal number system they developed, based on the number 60, is why we still divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. Babylonian astronomers' careful observations and mathematical models of planetary motion laid groundwork that would eventually lead to modern astronomy. The ziggurat design influenced religious architecture across the ancient world and resonates in our collective imagination through the Tower of Babel narrative. Perhaps most profoundly, Babylon represents a particular vision of empire, not merely conquest, but the idea that diverse peoples could be unified under law rather than held together solely through force. Hammurabi's insight that sustainable imperial control required legal frameworks rather than just military might anticipated political developments that wouldn't fully mature for millennia. His understanding that law should be publicly accessible, even to the illiterate through public readings, suggested a proto-democratic impulse toward transparent justice. Yet Babylon also reminds us of empire's inherent fragility. Neither Hammurabi's legal genius nor Nebuchadnezzar's architectural splendor could permanently secure their creations against the tides of history. The cycles of rise and fall, glory and destruction that characterize Babylon's long existence reflect broader patterns in human civilization. The way greatness emerges from unlikely circumstances, flourishes briefly, then fades as new powers rise to take its place. Standing in imagination before the ruins of Babylon, we confront both human achievement and its limits. The mud brick walls have dissolved back into the earth. The ziggurats have crumbled. The laws inscribed on stone have been carried off as spoils of war. Yet something essential persists. The ideas embedded in those laws. The astronomical observations recorded on clay tablets. The literary and religious traditions that flowed from Babylonian scribes into the cultural mainstream of Western civilization. Babylon fell, but its influence never truly died. It simply transformed, finding new expressions in new contexts, continuing to shape human society in ways both obvious and subtle. If this journey through Babylon's rise, glory, and fall has captivated you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're exploring the forgotten corners and towering achievements of ancient civilizations, uncovering the stories that shaped our world. More deep dives into the ancient world are coming, and you won't want to miss them. Until next time, keep exploring the past, because understanding where we came from illuminates where we might be headed.